Work. Mr Chairman, in summary, no financial sense, no strategic sense, no social sense.
I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. It's good to follow that fiery speech from David Cunliffe. Mr Speaker, Mr Chair, I rise with some proudness, with some pride, that the Green Party is probably the only party in this Parliament that hasn't been involved in asset sales. We saw the Labour Party, we saw New Zealand First, along with the National Bulger Shipley government, sell the assets. We know the Nats have done it. Now, the only person in this Parliament, however, who's going to be part of two governments to sell the assets is Peter Dunn. But look, Mr Chair, I'd like to point out that both the United Future, unfortunately not the United Future, the New Zealand First and the Labour parties have seen the errors of the ways. We've learnt from history. The only parties in this Parliament that aren't learning from history, it's the National Party, the United Future Party and the ACT Party. Look, we know the errors of our history. We saw $7 billion worth of state assets sold. In the preceding years, we've seen $21 billion in dividends, not returned to the taxpayer, where they should have gone. Those dividends returned to those private shareholders. So it's a privilege to take a call on this bill, this unpopular bill, this ideological bill, this controversial bill, and look at just part one, which removes Genesis, Meridian, Mighty River, Solid Energy from numerous bills, from the State-Owned Enterprise Bill, the Ombudsman Act, the OIA Act. It's a key plank in the government's agenda. They've got the drill it plank, the mine it plank, the frack it plank. We know a lot about the cut it plank from the budget last month, and here we've got the fifth plank of their entire economic plan for the next 3 years, which is to sell it. It's the only ideas they've got. But the question is, why are we doing this? Why are we having to, in part one, remove these bills from OIA scrutiny, from the important transparency role of the Ombudsman, from the social responsibility clause? Is it ideological? Is it because they haven't learnt the lessons from history? They brooded for the 9 years they were in opposition, in part because the decisions they made in government to flog off BNZ, to flog off Contact, earned them such unpopularity in the New Zealand constituency they were out of government for 9 years. Is it ideology? Or is it because they've got themselves in a fiscal hole with their poor management of the economy? We know the government's got money to throw at problems. They've got $14 billion to throw at motorways, $1.5 billion to subsidise polluters under their amended emissions trading scheme, $2 billion to throw at the wealthiest New Zealanders who got tax cuts they didn't need and that the government couldn't afford. The government's got themselves in such a fiscal hole, the only option they've got left is to flog off these assets now. But they know it's deeply unpopular. That's why we're seeing this mixed ownership model bill, which does keep 51% of the government's share. It's called the Mum Bill, the Mixed Ownership Model Bill, Mum. They talk about mums and dads, but it's not mums and dads who are going to be buying shares. It is those Goldman Sachs bankers that David Cunliffe was talking about. It's those people that benefited the most from their tax cuts. It's not the mums and dads who these assets already belong to. They already belong to us as Kiwis. Their assets, their treasures, their taongas we've built up over generation, that Kiwis and successive governments have contributed to, that we now derive such healthy dividend streams from, but it's what the government's quite happy to flog off. So in clauses 3, 4 and 5, we see these assets built up over generations taken out of the State-Owned Enterprise Act, and the crucial part of this is the social responsibility clause in the State-Owned Enterprise Act. The question for the Minister, and I don't know if Minister Heatley is able to take a call on this, is why do they need to take out social responsibility from it? We don't think there's any good reasons why this should be removed. Now look, the government says they're still going to be in majority ownership, 51% in the shareholder control from the government. What's wrong with social responsibility? Now, we're facing a huge number of problems with these assets as we are at the moment. We've seen electricity price rise around 70% in the last 2 years. We've seen a government who can't even argue or answer questions in the House today around the difference between the weighted average between private and public generators and retailers. What we know, though, is from that analysis, which the government can't critique, which the government can't even provide an answer on, is that what we know is that social responsibility clause is so crucial to maintain, because we do want to see cheaper electricity. around 15% of New Zealanders, I understand, are classed as being in energy poverty. It's a huge cost when you put in the galloping rate of inflation, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Gareth Hughes.
When you put in inflation, the rising energy bills that come from oil and imports, it's important we keep this. And it was refreshing to listen to the Honourable David Cunliffe's speech talking about climate change, talking about the end of cheap oil. It's good to hear a Labour MP talk about these crucial issues, and what we need to do is keep in your manifesto, congratulations, not the Labour Party of 5 years ago, but good to see the Labour Party of 2012 talking about these real-world issues. But we need to have the social responsibility clause so we can actually do something about it, Mr. Chair. But I want to know from the Minister, what is the plan? What's the problem with it? Is it because business has gone to the government and said, look, this contributes to such uncertainty, we don't want to focus on social responsibility, we want to focus on getting every drop of profit, no matter where it comes from, so we can increase the dividends for our shareholders. What's wrong with social responsibility? Why won't the government be voting for Russell Norman's clause, which would take these 4 bills out of clauses 3, 4 and 5? Now, when we look at clauses 6 and 7 that removes these assets and solid energy in particular from the OIA and the Ombudsman Act, again, we have to ask, what is the government's rationale for doing this if they're going to be keeping 51% majority control? If the taxpayer, if the country is keeping control, what's wrong with having ombudsman oversight? What's wrong with having everyday Kiwis be able to lodge an OIA request and find out what's happening with their majority control? Now, when you look from the Ombudsman submission to the Select Committee, the Ombudsman made the very salient point, which is, in this context, it seems highly desirable for the Ombudsman Act to continue to apply for a number of reasons, pointing out that there appears to be no necessity for companies currently subject to the Acts to cease to be so subject, apparently solely on the grounds that up to 49% of the shares in those companies are proposed to be made available for the sale to private sector interests. Now, the Ombudsman came to the committee, said it's a bad idea. The Ombudsman said that he should have control. And if we are keeping 51%, as the government and United Future reminds us, why on earth don't we have Ombudsman and OIA oversight over these majorities, state-owned clauses? Now, the fact is that we know this government's agenda is just so unpopular for the asset sales. There's no sense. We know it's going to cost more. We know that the bills are going to be on the order of $120 million from the taxpayer to subsidise the PR selling job, the spin job, $400 million likely from loyalty schemes, maybe $100 million in the first year from lost dividends. Look, this is around $600 million which the taxpayer is either forking out or missing out on. At a time of austerity, Mr. Chair, this is outrageous. This government is going to be wasting our money on assets which no one from the whole of New Zealand is going to benefit from. It makes no sense because in the long term we're going to be losing out on these dividend stream, which has been healthy. It's been a good rate of return, a lot greater than the cost of borrowing. We know it's not supported. They don't have a mandate. Just because the government continued to talk about a mandate doesn't mean they have one. Now, the only way they can actually argue convincingly they have a mandate is if they put it to the people. And that's why we saw such a rushed select committee process. The government's scared. The government's scared of the massive mobilisation happening right now with the Citizens Initiative referendum. And what we know is the results. Kiwis are missing out on these intergenerational treasures built up over generations. We are going to see higher electricity prices, and that's what the evidence says. We are going to see a loss of social responsibility from these very large, very influential former state-owned enterprises, and we're going to see electricity price rises. There must be a better way. Now, instead of flogging off these assets, we could be using them. We could be utilising that capital invested, utilising that experience, that expertise, that export stream which is already contributing to our economy. We could be using these assets to drive growth in a green economy. We could be using them to drive exports and clean energy expertise, technology and manufactured exports. Mr. Chair, there's got to be a better way that we can run our country for the sustainable long term, that we can actually contribute to dealing with the challenges, as David Cunliffe talked about, to deal with the significant fiscal hole we see at the moment. This is no way to run a country. There's no way to run an economy. There's a better way, Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr